Okay, let's dive in. Picture this. A top-tier Soviet fighter jet, the MiG-29, built for one job, really, taking on NATO aircraft.
Right, the ultimate adversary in the air, you might say.
Exactly. Now imagine, maybe 10 years after it shows up, that same jet is flying with NATO planes, sometimes even, giving them a real run for their money.
It sounds like something out of a spy thriller, doesn't it? But it actually happened. The MiG-29, or Fulcrum, as NATO called it.
Fulcrum,
It
brother.
was the Soviet answer to the new American fighters hitting the scene back then. But, well, history had other plans. It ended up joining the team it was designed to beat.
It's an incredible story. We've dug into some sources that track this whole journey, how the MiG-29 went from foe to, well, sort of friend within NATO.
And our goal here for you listening is to unpack that. How did this happen? What were the obstacles, and what did NATO actually learn from having the other side's tech in their own hangars?
So to get the full picture, we need to go back a bit, mid-70s.
Yeah, the U.S. was rolling out some seriously advanced fighters then. The F-15 Eagle, the F-16 Fighting Falcon, real game changers.
They really were. The F-15 in 76, F-16 around 78, their performance was, let's just say, a big step up from what the Soviets had flying at the time.
It definitely set a new standard, and this created a gap, a capability gap that the Soviet Air Force was, understandably, very keen to close. They needed a new frontline fighter fast.
Enter the Mikoyan Design Bureau, sometimes called Mikoyan, as you said. They got the job in 1974.
And they didn't hang about. The prototype, the plane that would become the MiG-29, it first flew October 6, 1977.
A quick turnaround. And then into service with the Soviet forces in 1982. That's when it got its NATO name, Fulcrum.
Okay, fast forward now to December 1991. The Soviet Union collapses. A huge geopolitical earthquake.
And this just throws everything up in the air, including the future of this massive MiG-29 fleet. Suddenly, you've got almost 800 of these jets scattered across, 15 newly independent countries?
It's a staggering number when you think about it. Russia ended up with the lion's share, maybe 450 or so. Ukraine got a big chunk too, around 220.
Belarus had some, Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
They were spread all over the former republics.
And you can imagine the problem straight away. These new countries, suddenly independent, are facing massive economic challenges. And maintaining advanced fighter jets, that's incredibly expensive.
Plus, the whole Soviet military-industrial system was disrupted, wasn't it? Getting parts became a nightmare.
Exactly. Production for the MiG-29 had been spread out deliberately across different Soviet republics. When those links broke, the supply chain for spare parts just fractured. Big time. Shortages became a serious, immediate issue.
And it wasn't just the former Soviet states dealing with this. Think about the Warsaw Pact countries. East Germany's MiGs, for instance.
Right. With German reunification in 1990, suddenly the unified German Luftwaffe inherited 24 MiG-29s from the East German Air Force.
Poland had a fleet too, about 32 initially. And when Czechoslovakia split, the Czech Republic and Slovakia inherited their own Soviet gear.
So all these nations, they've got the Soviet hardware, but they're looking west. They want security guarantees, maybe against Russia down the line.
Which leads to this really fascinating dilemma. How do you join NATO, the alliance your planes were built to fight, while you're still flying those planes?
It's a paradox, isn't it? For a lot of these Eastern European countries, joining NATO became the top priority. Security.
But they're knocking on NATO's door with fleets of MiGs and Sukhoi.
And when NATO started expanding, 1999 was the first big wave with Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic.
And later Bulgaria, Romania, the Baltics.
The cost of telling these countries, okay, great, you want to join, now scrap all your jets and buy Western ones immediately. Well, it just wasn't feasible. The money wasn't there.
So NATO had to be practical about it. They couldn't make replacing all that Soviet gear a condition for joining. They had to figure out how to work with it.
Which brings us back to Germany. Their experience integrating those ex-East German MiG-29s is really key here.
Yeah, the Luftwaffe gets these 24 Fulcrums in 1990, MiG-29As, and the two-seater UBs.
And interestingly, they didn't just park them or sell them off cheap. They decided to actually operate them.
Really? Put them into active German service?
Yep. Assign them to Jagdgeschwader 73 Steinhoff, that's Fighter Wing 73, based up at Lodz.
So what do they have to do to make them work within NATO?
Well, initially, between 90 and 92, the upgrades were kind of minimal, but essential for basic compatibility. Things like Western IFF stims, identification friend or foe, Crucial.
Can't shoot down your own side?
Precisely. New radios, too, VHF, UHF, so they could talk on NATO frequencies. Some cockpit changes, getting rid of Soviet electronic warfare kit, basic interoperability stuff.
And Poland, you mentioned, had the biggest NATO MiG fleet. They kept theirs flying for a long time.
They did. Started with 32, then actually bought more secondhand ones from Germany when they retired theirs, and some from the Czech Republic, too. And Poland invested in upgrades over the years between 95 and 2014 to make them more NATO-friendly.
We should probably mention the others, too. Hungary flew them for a while, 93 to 2010.
Bulgaria still flies them, about 15, I think. Romania had them, but phased them out just last year, 2023.
And Slovakia, of course, famously donated their remaining MiGs to Ukraine in 2023. A really significant move.
Absolutely. But, okay, making these jets actually work with NATO forces day to day. That wasn't simple. There were some big technical hurdles.
I bet. Communications must have been top of the list.
Huge issue. NATO planes use specific encrypted frequencies, secure beta links. The MiGs needed totally new comms packages. We're talking frequency-hopping radios to resist jamming, secure voice encryption.
NATO standard IFF transponders, you mentioned those.
Yes, and in some cases, they even integrated Link 16 terminals. That's the standard NATO data link for sharing tactical info in real time. The original MiG just didn't have anything like that. It was vital for proper integration.
Right. You need everyone on the same digital page, so to speak. What about weapons? Soviet missiles on a NATO plane, or vice versa?
That was tricky, too. The MiG's main missiles, the R-27 Alamo and the R-73 Archer, they use Soviet guidance logic, totally different from NATO standards like AMRAAM or Sidewinder. Trying to get Western missiles on the Fulcrum or fully integrate the Soviet ones into NATO fire control. Complex engineering.
And just keeping them flying. Spare parts, you mentioned that earlier. That must have been a constant headache once the Soviet supply lines vanished.
It really tested the ingenuity of these air forces. They had to get creative. Cannibalizing parts from grounded jets was common.
Stripping one plane to keep another flying?
Yep. Reverse engineering components, too. Setting up new supply chains, sometimes through third countries that still had connections to Russian manufacturers, and even designing and making their own Western-style replacement parts for things that kept breaking.
Wow. A real logistical feat. What about the pilots? Jumping from, say, an F-16 into a MiG-29, that's got to be different.
Completely different philosophy in many ways. NATO had to set up specialized training. Pilots needed basic Russian for cockpit labels and manuals sometimes.
Metric versus imperial units, too, I suppose.
So, yeah, different flight control concepts, Soviet standard procedures, even different ways of thinking about maintenance. It was a whole new world for Western pilots assigned to fly them, or fly alongside them.
So despite all these hurdles, these NATO MiGs saw real action, or at least real operational use. The German ones, you said, went to the U.S.
They did. Between 1991 and 2003, German Fulcrums regularly deployed stateside for DEAT, dissimilar air combat training. Basically realistic dogfight practice.
Giving U.S. pilots a chance to tangle with the real thing.
Exactly, and the results were, well, eye-opening for many.
How so?
The German MiG-29s apparently racked up surprisingly high kill ratios against top U.S. fighters like F-15s, F-16s, even FA-18s, specifically in close-in, within visual range fights. Dogsight.
Really? That seems significant.
It highlighted the MiG-29's incredible agility, especially its high angle of attack capability and turning performance up close. It was a wake-up call. Soviet design clearly prioritized that close-in maneuvering battle.
Which maybe wasn't the main focus for NATO doctrine at the time. More emphasis on beyond visual range.
Generally, yes. The U.S. Air Force's 510th Fighter Squadron actually developed specific tactics just to counter the MiG-29's advantages at low speeds, that knife fight performance.
And the Polish MiGs. They were doing actual frontline duty, weren't they?
Absolutely. Over 200 Baltic air policing missions between 2006 and 2023, intercepting Russian aircraft Su-27s, bombers like the Tu-95 near NATO airspace. Talk about irony. The former adversary policing the borders.
Incredible. Hungary used theirs for NATO air defense alerts, too, before retiring them.
Quick reaction alert duties. Standing ready.
So what did the NATO pilots who flew the Fulcrum actually like about it? What stood out?
From the sources, pilots often praised its amazing maneuverability, especially that high alpha handling we mentioned. Its instantaneous turn rate was apparently better than an F-16's. The IRST, the infrared search and track system, was also seen as very effective for passively detecting targets without using radar. Good and bad weather, apparently quite stable, and maybe surprisingly, relatively simple to maintain in the field compared to some complex Western jets.
But it wasn't all perfect, obviously. What were the downsides they found?
Well, limitations became clear too. The radar range was shorter than contemporary Western fighters. Big disadvantage for beyond visual range combat.
Fuel consumption.
Yeah, it was known to be quite thirsty, which limited its range and endurance, its loiter time on
Yeah.
station. The cockpit ergonomics weren't generally rated as highly as Western designs.
Higher workload for the pilot, especially in complex BVR fights.
That's often cited. And while field maintenance might have been simpler in some ways, the overall maintenance hours required per flight hour were generally higher than for comparable Western aircraft like the F-16. Needed more upkeep.
So looking back at this whole story, the MiG-29's journey from Soviet enemy number one to a NATO asset, it's just extraordinary.
It really is. It shows how major political shifts can force completely unexpected technological mashups.
And it really highlights the flexibility, the sheer ingenuity of these NATO countries. Faced with a tricky situation, economically and strategically, they found ways to make it work, to integrate this enemy tech.
And in doing so, they learned a lot. The MiG-29's performance, especially up close, definitely surprised some people and offered valuable lessons about different design priorities and combat tactics.
It makes you think, doesn't it? This whole experience of taking an adversary's weapon and turning it into your own tool.
It does. And maybe the question for you listening is, what other big challenges out there might actually hold surprising opportunities for collaboration, for learning something new? If we could just get past the initial us versus them, what can we learn from embracing or at least understanding the other side's strengths? Definitely food for thought.